Bill, thank you so much for that. That was amazing. It's really interesting the order of things with Bill going first and me walking through what I've got for you guys today. Is that a lot of what he mentioned talks a lot about the environment in the atmosphere that we are all facing, regardless of what where you sit in an organization, right? There's so much content, there's so many opinions, there's lack of trust, there's all this stuff that day in and day out, day in and day out, you guys are having to deal with and create strategies to respond to. And so, what I'm going to talk about with you guys today is how do you get to a place with your brand that you can respond immediately to anything that's going on. And from that place, you can actually create all the content that you know that you need to create, that you can develop language and messaging that not only makes space for you in your market, but it also works to bind your culture together. Because when you are faced with having to communicate constantly with everything that's going on, it's only going to get faster. How do you do that instinctively? And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do you get your brand to that place to actually be able to do that? And so this, I came across this quote from Toni Collette, which I love. She says, the better you know yourself, the better your relationship with the rest of the world. And I find this to be incredibly true. The more that you are able to understand who you are, what you care about, it helps you make decisions around how you spend your time, about what you say, about the kind of things you choose to invest your life in. And then from that, sorry, it keeps happening. So from that place, you're then able to connect with people. You're able to be more intentional with your time. And therefore, you're able to have a much deeper, much richer relationship with the rest of the world. And so this kind of helps to set the tone for what I'm going to talk about here today. But first, a bit about me. Before we get into all this stuff, I'm a father. I have 2 young kids, which is one of the main focuses of my life. My wife and I have been together for 18 years, went to high school together. And we also, together, we lead a house church movement here in Los Angeles. And I share that because it says a lot about, I feel like it says a lot about who I am. And I really am all about relationship. I'm really all about connecting with people. I'm really all about understanding who are you, what motivates you, what drives you, because I believe, and this you'll see it a little in a couple minutes, we've really built our company around this, is that we believe that everyone has a message for our moment in time. And I believe that personally for every individual, and we believe that as individuals come together and they create a company, we believe that is also true for a brand, and that's what we believe a brand actually is. And so my story starts with, and it's all relevant to what we're going to be discussing, is that I started on the social media execution side of things, circa 2004-ish. MySpace was king, Facebook didn't exist, Twitter just started, no Instagram. So no Instagrammable experiences to plot your journey on. And my task with Toyota, Crackle, which is a Sony on-demand entertainment platform, and then Sony Corporate, was to really be the person on the front lines who was responsible for coming up with content day to day to day that was responsible for connecting who we are as a company and connecting it to who individuals are. Anybody who's in social media, who's on the communications, the manager, the strategy side of things understands how hard that is to do that on a daily basis, but also to get the kind of response that you're kind of being measured against. So that's the kind of proving ground where I started, watching all of this grow up. I also recognized in that moment the difficulty that I was having in knowing the culture internally and being tasked with communicating in a way that connected, because I was seeing a lot of disconnects between what we said we were about, the kind of culture that I was experiencing inside the company, and the kind of messages that I was being tasked with putting out. There was a discrepancy, not any huge ethical issues, but when you kind of sit at that transition point between internal and external, you sort of see where there might be some inconsistencies. And so that led me to want to understand, well, it feels like we're not connected to our heart as a company. It seems like what we're saying is what we either want people to hear, or it's what we really believe, but we're not really living it out. And so I went on a journey to understand, well, how do I help companies get more true about who they are so that everything that we say actually makes a resonant impact and we can actually move some things forward, not just for our company, but in culture. So I moved to an agency where these are some of the brands that were under my responsibility as I built the team to really help them position themselves. So it's about looking at your customers, your competition, your culture, everything that's happening in the world, and how do you find the space? How do you create the messaging? How do you really develop the strategy to make headway for some of these brands? And so the process that I went on there was learning a lot of the tools, but really understanding that everything comes back to identity. It really comes back to, what does this company actually believe about itself? Because what you believe is what you are going to, that's how you're going to behave out in the world. So I chose to step out and start to build our own company, focusing fundamentally around identity. And there's a lot of ways in which people might think of identity, especially in the creative and the marketing space. Some people might think logo, they might think visual system, creative, all of these expressions, but actually we think about identity in the context of, who are you? What do you believe? What's your purpose? Those core binding pieces that actually create the heart of a brand. And so we've been honored to be able to have done this kind of work for Pedro Martinez, who's a Hall of Fame baseball player for the Boston Red Sox. He never had a brand before, and so we were able to come in and help him and his foundation not just understand who are we in our moment in time. He stepped out of being a baseball player, and now he's transitioning into the next phase of his life. So who is he now? He was this, but who is he now? So it was a very deep, and as you could probably guess, a very personal journey for him, and that's the kind of exploration that is required if you're going to go on this journey to find those deep things. They're very valuable, but it is a journey you have to go on, and we've been able to do some work for UNICEF as well to really get them to a place of deep understanding of themselves so that they're able to speak from a place of conviction, which is what we're talking about today. So how we approach things is that we believe that everyone carries a message our moment needs. And we say everyone separate because we work with nonprofits, public figures, as well as corporations and brands. And this is really the approach that we take, is understanding, because we want to get to that messaging point. As marketers, we want to be able to put messages out there in the world that make an impact. So how do we get to that place where we can create messages that have resonance? And that's really where conviction comes in. And so I want to talk a minute about our moment in time, because all of this, yes, was reflected in what we just walked through, but it reveals the need for brands, for people, and also for brands to understand their conviction. So we have evidenced a bit of this through the last conversation that we just had with this presentation, but I think it would be difficult to argue with the fact that we live in a bit of a polarized moment. Social media, opinions from whatever industry you look at, there are factions and there are places that are kind of separating. There are obviously a lot of ways in which it's happening, but I feel like the overriding, presiding sentiment is that there is a polarization that's happening between people, and a lot of it's being fueled by opinions, things we're experiencing, things we're seeing on Facebook, and a lot of these are all very human things that we're all having to kind of absorb and respond to in some sort of way. And the reason why this is relevant is that we intake all of this as people, and then we take it into our workplaces, and we still carry all that with us. And so when we're in a work environment, we're also, responding to the effects of things that are happening in a larger context. And all this makes sense for why conviction is important for us to understand. We're also being bombarded by all this constant content, as he mentioned in the prior presentation. There's so much coming at us that it's difficult sometimes to have a real conversation with somebody, to really communicate in a way that you can understand and you can really develop a nuanced perspective around something. It feels like you have to move on to the next thing because the next thing is kind of hunting you down. And there's also overwhelming options. There are so many ways in which you can make choices and so many different options that are out there, which is great because you can personalize, you can make a lot of different decisions, but ultimately it's hard to make a commitment on certain things because there's so many different options and there's so many different ways you can do it that there's a lack of maybe commitment or reliability towards making some choices. And so we're taking a step back and we say, you know what, there's a lot of challenges with where we're at, but also as people who are responsible for making products and putting messages out there, there's actually an opportunity in this if we can understand when we look at the polarizing things that are happening. There's a lot of content coming at people. There's a lot of options. How do we get underneath all of this? Because when we look at the polarization, what's actually happening there? As people are separating, there's actually a really deep need for connection. People are wanting to really connect. They're wanting to actually build intimacy and trust. So underneath all of that, there's connection that's really wanting to happen, but it's difficult. Constant content. Again, as I mentioned, there's so much coming at you. It's difficult to pause and rest and be like, okay, I'm going to just sit with this for a minute, and I really want to have a conversation, have a communication with somebody about this. And the overwhelming options, there's so much on the table, it's difficult to really attach yourself to something and really make a commitment. It's tough to rely on that. And so when we look at these three things that are opportunities or challenges in our modern age, the moment in time we find ourselves in, but there's actually an opportunity in all this because we believe, and we've evidenced from the work that we've done in people's personal lives as well as through the brands that we've worked with, is that conviction actually is a thing that will ground you to what it is that you fundamentally, without a doubt, cannot be moved from. If you want to go out and take a stand in the world, if you want a message, if you want to have a message that people are going to respond to, if you want to take a stand, you need to know what you're standing on. And conviction is that thing that will do that. So when we think about convictions versus beliefs, and there's a lot of language companies use to describe their heart, that thing that really binds everyone together. There's vision and mission and purpose and values and all of this stuff that what we've experienced ultimately kind of becomes yeah, that's great, yeah, it feels good, but I know you say X, Y, and Z, but I just saw A, B, and C saying 1, 2, 3. It's LMNOP, and that kind of creates some inconsistencies. There's some integrity issues that I'm seeing with this when we're talking about internal culture. And so there's all this language kind of word soup that exists there. So there's a need to simplify. There's a need to get down to the real guts of it. Externally, you might have particular beliefs that are helping you kind of operate and make choices and put language out there. But when you are in a moment that we're in right now, where every single person in your organization is actually a mouthpiece for it, there's a lot of ways in which inconsistencies in your messaging can happen. It can leak out from any part in your company. So how do you create something that is so fundamental that everyone is standing on the exact same spot? Well, conviction is what will do that. That is that very firmly held belief that actually grips you that you will not move from. It's actually the thing that is immovable from your company. When we think about what does this actually look like when it is operating out in the world, you actually mentioned Patagonia earlier. What does this look like when a company is operating from a place of conviction? So you have Dick's Sporting Goods overhauled their gun policies after the Parkland shooting. We did some work with Dick's. We weren't responsible for helping them understand their conviction, but we were helping them understand that they have a program called Youth Matters, which started out as a marketing kind of CSR effort. And in that, we actually recognize, this is so much bigger than selling sports equipment to youth. There's something really tangible, something very powerful about this. And so as they migrated it from being something that was on the outside of the company to something that was really at the heart of the company, it actually forced them to make different choices about the moment in time that they found themselves in. So when this happens, and the question around youth safety ends up becoming bigger than how do I make safe shin guards or safe sporting equipment, the idea of protection actually elevated itself up to, hey, we create a product that is being used. This is, again, apart from any beliefs you might have around this particular topic, what they chose to do is they were so convicted by the reality that youth matter that we can't sell guns, or we have to change our policy because we're actually complicit in this. If we believe this is true and we see this is happening, we can't not do something about it. So it's funny that the thing that is immovable actually causes you to move, which is the funny thing. For Patagonia, this is taken from, they have a lawsuit going against the Trump administration for some changes towards the Bears Ears Monument National Park. And Patagonia they're just operating from a different place. They're not making choices off of how to actually, sell more things. I don't know exactly what their conviction is. I could probably put some guesses towards it, but there's a fundamental belief around our relationship with the environment, and they make their choices from that place. And they're not trying, I don't think that it's a conscious effort, maybe it is, to grow their market share based off of making these political decisions, but it's actually creating a lot more awareness in earned media, but it's very true to them. Actually, they made a decision about how we're going to operate our business because our business is actually making an impact on the world, and there's a responsibility in that, and we actually need to understand what that is, not just so that we can continue to grow our brand, but there's actually something very deep and meaningful about what it is that we're doing. So they took the time to figure that out. So when we talk about uncovering conviction, so how do you do that? So the way in which we go about this is that, it's, as you could imagine, these are like personal questions that you're really asking yourself. And I know that people in here probably represent different areas of the organization, different levels of the organization. And so as we walk through some of these questions, and this is a small sample of what we use when we take our partners through this process, is that it needs to be as deep and as personally meaningful as you're able to get. And we're trained listeners to hear what you're saying, more importantly, what you're not saying, and really poke that, because there's always more underneath to get to. Because we believe that conviction is the cornerstone of brand building. Think about a building. A cornerstone is that fundamental first piece that you put down that actually services as the fundamental reinforcement that everything else is built upon. And we believe that every company has at least one of these. When we work with companies, we work to find that one thing. Because, and I'll show you a little later, when you know that one thing, it actually makes it a lot easier to develop all your messaging, all your creative, because it's all flowing from one place. It's like a well that you're just drawing from over and over again. Not just for externally, but internally as well. It's really that cornerstone of brand building. Because a brand it's gone through a lot of evolutions, understanding what a brand is over the years. But really, it's about taking what it is that you're all choosing to come together to do. Instead of selling a product, when you start from a place of conviction, you look at Dick's and you look at Patagonia, they're not really a brand, they're kind of a movement now. And how do you get to that place? Well, it starts with a conviction. It's something that you are fundamentally unable to not do. You have to do it. It compels you to do something. You're so immovable, you actually move. And that place of solidarity actually is really interesting to people because they feel it because it's a heart thing that actually activates it because it was designed into us as humans. So how do you go about uncovering your conviction? What's that kind of posture you have to take when you step into trying to figure it out? Well, the first thing that we say is that you need to start from the heart. And what we mean by that is it's a very personal journey that you go on. When we come together with teams, we try to, make sure that the key decision makers and those who are responsible for really carrying the culture are there, because there was a stat that I read not too long ago where it speaks about 80% of culture comes from the essence of the founder, the actual personhood of the founder. And when you look at the whole rise of influencers and what's happening there, I mean, their equity is 100% about who they are. It's a lifestyle. It's the identity that has created a name, created a space, created a gravity around them. And all of that has become an expression of who they are. I mean, a lot of, especially in the early days, people who were just putting out videos on YouTube. I mean, a lot of the YouTube influencers who started very early, they were just doing things that they cared about. There was a passion, there was a conviction that they were wanting to outwork, and it was kind of coming to life through their content. And then, lo and behold, they just grew and grew and grew, and then they got to a place of where they are now. But again, all of it was really around their place of identity, who they are, and then how that is expressed through all the different creative ways in which they could do it. So starting from the heart really is a commitment to holding yourself accountable to what's really in here. Because we pick up things all the time, life kind of layers on you, and it's really about being committed to that intimate journey of kind of figuring all that stuff out. And we're doing it together as a team. I mean, we're all choosing to come together, especially those who are the leadership of companies. I mean, people are choosing to dedicate the majority of their life to their work. I mean, you spend probably more time in the office than you do outside of it. So everything that we do, it should be meaningful. We should be connected to it. So we need to connect to here so that we can bring it and we can all kind of circle around it and see, what are we actually doing here? Because the products that we create, the message that we create, it always connects. But we're just trying to do is kind of find that very, very lowest, the bottom of it all. And dig deeper is the second thing. So there's a pretty famous methodology for kind of excavating things. It's called the 7 whys. We use that from time to time, but the point is that you just keep asking why against something until you can't go any lower. And it's a bit of an uncomfortable journey, all of this, because you're tasking yourself to continue to challenge yourself, to continue to kind of break the mindsets and the perspectives that kind of keep you thinking about things in a certain way. It's a very healthy practice, but it's also super uncomfortable. And the last one is painfully honest. I mean, we have had many awkward times when someone might say something from a place of they're super convinced that what they said is actually true, and listening to it and kind of adding up a couple of other things, like, well, I know that you said this, but I'm also seeing X, Y, and Z, and you said A, B, and C, so, I mean, those things don't really connect. And so there's a moment of humility and a moment of really having to step into this process and be like, you know what, I know that there's something very deep and very meaningful here, and there's a lot of ways in which we can say it, and we don't want to, like, jump to, like, what's the thing yet, because there's an impulse to want to just, like, get to it already. But if you go on the journey to actually figure out what's the fundamental thing that we absolutely, without a doubt, believe is true, when we find that, and we can be willing to go on the journey to find it, it unleashes a lot. And I'll show you a bit about that in a minute. So, some questions that we ask of the people that we walk through this process with. One of them is, what's your deepest desire to accomplish here on earth? So a lot of these might feel like really big and very abstract and almost spiritual questions in a sense. They are. But we believe that there's a lot in here that we don't tap and apply it to what it is that we do every single day. Another one, and this is just a small sample. Is there a moment you can pinpoint where you were more aligned than ever before? I'm curious, as you guys are reading these and thinking through it, I mean, the first step in this, again, it's applying it to your own self first. I know when we go through this process, I mean, we always afterwards, there's so much like personal development and personal questions that we walk away with for ourselves that yes, it's applicable to the work that we're doing, but um, but it stirs up a lot, and that's the point. It's supposed to stir up a lot. Because as you become more aware of who you are and what you care about personally, we all want you to bring that to the thing that we're all trying to create together. That's where culture starts. What do you want your legacy to be? I'm not sure if a lot of companies think about that, because not everything lasts forever. So, how do you understand the thing that you want to build and create and leave it for after, to leave it to exist after you're gone? What keeps you up at night? What's weighing on you? We have to pay attention to the things that burden us, not just from a business perspective, but these are all very human questions, and we're all humans who are coming together trying to do a thing, and we all want that thing to be meaningful. What types of conversations do you have the most to contribute to? This really requires paying attention to the types of things you end up talking to or talking about most often, the kind of people that you connect with, the the moments when you feel like you've come most alive, when you've added or contributed something to a conversation. There's something in that we do not want to ignore. Imagine you have the attention of everyone. What do you want to say? And this isn't, a lot of these might be like your shower or your bathtub moments where you're like, and my wife does this all the time. She's like, so I just had an interview with Oprah. And I mean, no joke, it's like every week. I'm like, geez, I mean, at some point you're going to have the most amazing conversation with her. But it's really about, like, what do you have to say? I mean, and it's okay. And don't judge yourself on what it is you want to say, because you're saying it because it's coming from a place. And the more that we can come together and figure out, like, why is it coming from there? And everyone brings that. I mean, when I speak about this context, I'm envisioning the rooms that we're in. And these are exercises that we take people through. You can take your own people through them. But it's really about honoring what we have in our heart and bringing it to the space, and then believing that there's something in all this, because this is what we're really here for. And if we're really here for this, why would we not let this fuel all it is that we're trying to do here? Like, we build things that go out into the world, and these things, like, they contain this. And so why would you not want to put language around that and figure it out? Because it's incredibly powerful, especially the younger generation who chooses work based off of purpose and meaning and all of this like deep stuff. This is an incredible employee retention tool, because what you're doing is you're infusing your company with something that's really meaningful. What's the meaning of your name? Yes, in the brand company name, but also personally. I mean, we found so many interesting things when people, they might come and, some might have an unusual name or a name that kind of stands out. And we look it up, and it's funny how similar or how much you can see who they are or who they could be. That's kind of rooted and packed into a lot of the meaning of their name. It's interesting. It's an interesting. These are all devices that we're using to kind of like poke around and excavate all that stuff you can't see, but it's really powerful. What motivates you to get out of bed in the morning? What's your why? The beautiful thing is after you go through all these questions, you're kind of left with like all this really rich, dense stuff. And as I'll show you as we go to the end, what do we do with all of this stuff? Nothing is ever lost in this excavation process. Because when you think about brand language, when you think about brand architecture, you have vision, mission, values, all this stuff. There's an order to all of the language. And what we're trying to do is get to the very, 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 very bottom of it, because from that place, everything else kind of falls in line. I mean, my brother is a chiropractor, and he does a particular type of practice called NUCA. And what it is they just focus on the little space between where your head and your spine connect. That's where your spinal cord goes down. And all they do is they just adjust it a little bit, because what they find is that the majority of issues physically people have in their bodies, it actually kind of corresponds to obstructions of the spinal cord. And so that actually, if this 10-pound weight is off this small little hole where your spinal cord goes down, if it's off a little bit and it's pinching something and it's out of alignment, if it's out of alignment, it actually causes a whole lot of issues. Funny how we're built like that. But the point of all this is get to that place that's the most orienting, the most aligning, and then we can build everything from that place. What has always been true about what you do, there is an essence and there's an evidence, there's a pattern of deep things in the normal things that we do every day. It could be physically what you do or produce. It could be why you do it. It could be how you do it. It's just being curious and asking all of these questions, putting them on the table, and then connecting all the dots and figuring out, okay, what's the deep human truth here? How do I put language around it so that I can contextualize it to our internal teams? I can help them understand, how does this apply to the way in which we approach marketing? How does this apply to the way in which we do HR? How does this apply to how we speak to, customer, consumer segment A, B, C, D, and B? So what does all of this do? What's the outcome of really investing yourselves in this process? I mean, there's a lot of ways in which companies try to figure out, how do we own our space? How do we grow? How do we make an impact? And we've been through the gamut of them. We've got the positioning strategies, white space, like all these different ways to think about it. But the bigger thing that we like to think about is, we believe that we are actually all part of a story that's happening right now, that's unfolding. And we want to understand what's happening in that story. And then what's our part to play? What's the message that we have to contribute to our moment in time? Because we're all here for a reason right now. And what's that reason? And conviction helps us put language around that reason so we can be consistent and we can get connected and we can have conversations and we can communicate what that is to whomever, whenever we need to. And part of the benefit to a lot of this is that I showed you some positive ways in which being connected to your conviction helps you, enter conversations you never had the permission to before. Like dicks and guns. I mean, they didn't have a permission to really do that. There was no reasoning behind it unless they had this conviction in their company that, youth matters, so we got to do something about it. Think about the internal strife they would have created if they'd been talking from the platform or at town halls internally about the fact that, youth matters, but then this thing happens and the company doesn't do anything about it. And they don't have a language or a context to have even a conversation about it. Companies, people, we are continually tasked with, especially now, having to respond to something right away. I mean, if there's any delay in any of your communications, especially if it's about you, the longer the clock ticks, the anxiety rises, and then there's an expectation that you know exactly what it is. And I believe that one of those reasons is because social media has created an expectation that companies are individuals, because we're acting like individuals on platforms that are all about lifestyle and personalization. So here you are, this company that looks like one, right? That's actually a company of, or it's a collection of people that might be anywhere from 5 people to 5,000 to 50,000. I mean, I ran social media for Sony, where we're responsible for communicating on behalf of 100,000 people. There's a expectation that you know what to say and that what you're going to say is going to be accurate throughout the entirety of everything you've ever said. I mean, we don't, it's great that there's agencies now going back through and deleting all the horrible stuff that you said before you had an understanding of how to censor yourself. But there is this expectation that you respond right away. So how do you respond consistently in a way that is true to who you are and also has the evidence of all your other communications prior to that? It's super, super important. So when we think about how do all of these things stack up, when we think about how do you create language for a brand that actually isn't about having all the things that you should have. Like we should have a mission and vision and values and all these things because this is what we do. We approach it from a very human place. So you start with conviction. Okay, this is the thing. And it's usually very simple, but it's actually really meaningful because when you find it, you're like, oh, I see how that's evidenced here. And I see how that's evidenced here. And that makes sense why here. So it actually shines a lot of light and gives a lot of context. And it kind of puts things in order. So when you start with conviction, you're then able to figure out your purpose. And I know a lot of companies now, and I think the hot kind of thing has been purpose for a while. And I think the product of that has been companies trying to find how to differentiate themselves and how to sort of catch this like cultural wave of meaningfulness, new values, wanting to find some sort of deeper meaning to what it is that we are committing our life to. But we believe you can't get to your purpose until you know your conviction. And the reason for that is that if I know absolutely, fundamentally what I believe, I now know what I must do about it. And purpose, for us, it's about intention. And when you think about purposefully engaging in something, you have a goal, you have an action. There is a very distinct thing you're trying to do, and you're pouring yourself in the service of that thing. So I don't believe that purpose is something that is eternal. I believe that purpose can change. If you're doing something purposely, you're trying to meet a need. That need can change. If you succeed in what it is your purpose is, and that's all you have, what do you do as a company? If you have a conviction that it's actually a much deeper thing, it actually gives you permission to do a lot of different things. That might be for different moments in time. But when you understand who you are, you understand what you must do, and all of that is in the service of what we say aspiration. And we choose aspiration because we don't say vision, because there's a real yearning, a real like stretching when you think about aspiration. And we try to use really human terms because we are human, and we want people to attach onto these things because we believe them. We want them to believe them themselves because we're all trying to go in one direction together. So when we say aspiration, that's the hope, that's the longing, that's the desire we're all kind of pointing ourselves towards. And if we're standing from a place of conviction where we know absolutely what it is that we are firmly not going to move against, we now know through our purpose how to move, and we know the hope we have once we've moved in that direction. And this is an incredible, as we've seen before, alignment tool to get everyone on the same page and to really reduce the kind of the word clutter that happens when companies try to put their DNA together, because it actually gives specific directions and context around these really meaningful things, and it helps to really reduce employees finding fatigue with some of these things. What's interesting about this that we found, actually we were having a conversation the other day, is that when you choose to find out the conviction and you find your words, there's actually a lot of responsibility in that, because we're now saying that, for example, you might have the word integrity in it. That's actually a really, really big word. And there's actually a responsibility that is necessary. If you're going to say that we are about integrity in some form or shape, you actually have to be accountable to that. Because if you're not, definitely people on the outside of the company are. And as they see things start to manifest and there's a disconnect, you're going to get called on it, and it's definitely going to be something that you're not going to want to have to clean up. So the thing about starting from this place is that it actually creates, it actually helps to bind people together, because you can be super honest about, hey, this is our conviction. This is actually what we fundamentally believe. This is what we are really doing here. And we're all a part of it. And we are all tasked with coming together and living this out. It actually creates accountability for one another. And from that place, it creates trust and relationship and culture. Because people aren't doing it out of a place of obligation. They're doing it out of a place of responsibility and relationship, and really wanting to outwork it because it's actually connected to their heart. They care about it. So where do you go from all of this? Well, as I mentioned before, if conviction is your starting place, and then you were able to add on, now you know what your purpose is for our moment, and then the aspiration from that place, it actually becomes a really rich well from which you can draw all of your communications and your creative assets. These are just a couple of examples of what it is that can come from knowing all of this really deep stuff. If you know who you are, you know what to say. You know how to create copy and content for social media, especially social media, because the volume of this content that we have to create in order to get our message out there, in order to connect with people, it needs to come from a place that's always true and it's always consistent, especially as there's all these different platforms that your content is going to. And you want to create consistency, you want to create reliability, you want to create some sense of commitment around it. So conviction is that anchor point. It kind of keeps you attached to the same thing. Website copy, oftentimes the exact language and wording that's chosen with these deep DNA aspects, conviction, purpose, aspiration, that just becomes the inspiration from which you actually start to develop your website copy and every single communications piece, because it's coming from the same place, which is great because you are actually able to the point of releasing some creative control to your influencers. How do you do that? I mean, it's very nerve-wracking to sort of like give your brand that you spent 10 years, maybe 100 years cultivating very intentionally. How do I just give that to somebody who might be a 20-something-year-old who's doing a selfie on some canoe in the middle of somewhere? How do I do that? Well, if I'm able to give them and onboard them to what it is that we actually believe, what's our conviction, and what our purpose is as a company, and we are able to surround them with some of this deep stuff, we're connecting. Hopefully, that's a way to sort of vet them. You're aligning from a values and from a beliefs perspective. And from that place, there's actually a lot more trust that can be fostered because you're connected at the heart versus some of these other images or lifestyle or perception or positioning that that they've had to use to kind of create their own little space. Sales sheets, it's a lot. It's very easy to start to figure out and contextualize why you're valuable when you can tie it back to some of these deeper things. How do you pop up at an event? How does a brand physically come to life so that everything that you are can be experienced and felt when you step into that? That was a lot of the work that we did at the agency that I was at in the middle. How do you manifest a brand physically? Well, you got to get to the core stuff so that you can then bring everything to life and it all hangs together. Onboarding, so when you think about externally, these are just some things that it releases. When you think about internally, I mentioned it before, onboarding is huge. How do you quickly get new employees up to speed, not having to give them, a 60 to 70 page brand book that I think we've all seen, but how do you actually give them something that is clear and concise? And if there's one thing that they need to remember, it's the conviction. It actually makes it a lot easier for them to hold on to some of these core DNA pieces. Recruitment. It's very competitive out there, trying to position your company in a way that is interesting, a way that is differentiated. And so we also find that when you're able to communicate some of these deeper things and starting from a place of conviction, recruitment is actually a lot easier because it's very clear what it is you stand for. Team building as well, obviously. You're able to create experiences in ways to really manifest and figure out how do we get our hands around all the different ways in which we can bring our core conviction to life. And innovation, as I mentioned earlier. How do we take this thing that we know to be fundamentally true about us and start to almost use it as a lens and look at all of our different departments and see, if we believe this, then how might it change things in finance or HR or comms or? Because that actually releases innovation because you're not holding on to all the stuff from the past that might cause you to not pursue an idea, or it might cause you to shoot down an opportunity because that's how we've always done things, or that's not how we do things here. Well, if we really know what it is that we really believe and what we're all really doing here, we can actually take a fresh look at all that we are doing and align it to this thing. Not just to obviously release new growth opportunities, but I mean, it's an incredible binding tool to really kind of get people on the same page. So, with that, I'd love to turn it over if there's any questions from what we just walked through. Yeah.
What do you do when you are working with a customer or a client and you have this sort of dysmorphia where their personal.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
This is very unique.
And loud. Talk loudly in the box, please.
Okay, so what do you do when you are working with a client who has sort of a dysmorphia between what their personal conviction is and what the company brand ethos is? You know, not necessarily that they're conflicting, but just that they're different. You know, how do you work to get all the teams to buy into whatever that brand conviction is?
I see. Right. So the question is, if there's either a conflict or there's some sort of misalignment with like someone's own personal conviction and what the company's might be. Is that accurate? Okay. Well, first off, it's a group activity. So we as a leadership team are choosing to come together and kind of agree that we're in a sense on the same playing field, because while 80% of the culture might come from like the personhood of the founder, the executive leadership team are the ones who are seen as and regarded as leaders of the company. So from a bottom-up perspective, I guess if you call it, we all carry, leadership team all carries a similar weight in terms of the influence. So first off, there's a recognition of that, because we're coming into, this is a safe space, and we're really trying to pour everything out on the table. So that's probably the first prerequisite, to try to get around any sort of hierarchies in terms of, I believe this, well, I believe this. It helps to sort of defuse any of that which might happen. Additionally, we have to balance personal convictions with how does this fit into our moment in time, right? What's the larger cultural context? What's the bigger story that we're a part of? What's happening in our industry? What's happening in our products? What's happening in the lives of our customers or our consumers? There's all of these calibration points that service as kind of balancing tools to really, even out the spectrum in terms of the weighting on people's like personal opinions versus what's going to be good for the betterment of the business. Because again, we're servicing like the big thing that we're after versus like your own personal perspective. What's great is that when you're in these rooms and people are able to like put down all the stuff that's in their heart and what they think, what's great is that there is something that binds it all together. There always is, because we're all human. There's something fundamental we all believe about what it is we're doing here and what this thing could be and what it's made for our moment in time. But now you also have everyone's intentions and desires on the table. So now when we're thinking about like our visibility strategy for our CEOs or our people who are leading the company, we now have an understanding of, okay, if like this is our story, I now see your individual characters and how all of that can weave together in creating a bigger brand than having it just be the CEO or just being somebody else. So sort of a twofold. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. I've never talked into a cube before. That talked a lot to my question too. But I keep thinking about the Dick's example in particular, and how a change like that doesn't just impact the company externally, but also it's going to impact the company internally a lot. How do you help companies navigate some of those challenges?
That's a good question. Yeah, because Dick's actually lost money. They lost money doing that. Um, so um, I think a lot of it, from what we've experienced, um, just comes down to context. Um, Especially since this is kind of a new thing that we're all moving into. I mean, this Dick's thing, I don't know where the Patagonia thing 15 years ago, I mean, Tom's maybe, but this is like on another level because they're speaking into like culture, they're speaking into politics, like places that were totally off limits to brands and companies before. All of a sudden, they're like they have a platform to speak into those places now, and we're not used to it yet. Um, so a lot of it does tend to come down to constantly contextualizing why we're making this decision, and getting down to the reasons, and being really upfront about the cost. I mean, when you choose to stand on a conviction, there could be a cost associated to that. And ultimately, it comes down to, are you okay with that? Because the benefit is huge. It actually really is big, because now not only are you able to bind the company together in a much stronger, more tangible way, because it's super emotional and it's very like core to the human heart. But you now have permission to start to do things and say things out in culture that you never had the permission to before, because you're always about your product and you're always about selling something. But now, if people can understand, we're really about a movement, not necessarily having to speak that, but that's really what's happening. I mean, you see Dick's and Patagonia is a movement. They didn't try to be, but they just were. First off, there's generally a sentiment internally that people understand it and they realize it's the bigger thing, it's the deeper thing, and there's a consensus around it usually. But constant contextualization around it is super helpful. Because, I mean, when something especially like sales might drop, then it starts spinning like fear around performance and job and security and da 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 da. So when people are connected from that place, a lot of it does have to be excuse me, a lot of the pressure around that is distributed through relationships. So this type of approach requires companies to have authentic relationships internally, because you got to be able to talk about the real stuff. And if there's any issues or fears or questions, then we should be able to talk about them in a safe space. But approaching it in this way tends to push that, brings that stuff up to the surface. So communication, contextualization usually is a thing that brings the issues out in the open, and then we can talk about them. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. Cool. Well, thank you guys.
One more.
Oh, wait.
Nope.
Hold,
One
please.
more.
The cube is coming.
Hi. The company I work for has 3 different divisions, and they sell into different markets. How do you navigate that internally when figuring out your conviction?
Okay. Are these cultures or markets very culturally different?
Yeah, we've got a consumer division, we've got commercial government, and we've got biopharma, which is
Yeah.
an option.
Okay. The power of conviction comes down to it being phrased in a very human way. For example, some of the ones that we have worked through before and it might sound very plain and very obvious, but for these people, it's revelatory. You are unstoppable. That's one of them. And that was a narrative that was true since the very beginning. And when we were able to get to that place of uncovering that and putting the language around it, it was true about the brand. It was true about the trajectory. It was true about what they knew was right for them in the next season as they were evolving. But as you can see, it's a super simple phrase you're saying. And it might seem obvious or might seem elementary, but the hard part comes in figuring out what is that thing that connects to everything else. And it's usually something that's very human, and it's very, it speaks into people's identities in the way in which they can connect with. People connect with hope. People connect with overcoming. People connect with value and worth. And so when you're trying to develop something that cuts across cultures, or maybe cuts across different languages, you got to start with it being human first. And the nuances will come out. I mean, we have a discovery process where we interview people and market research, because we're coming into these meetings with leadership already armed with all the stuff that we need to know. And now we're here to kind of see, how do you see all of this? Because you guys are the ones that are going to have to, like you carry a lot of the culture. So we already kind of have an idea about the different ways in which we need to nuance things based off of the research we've done and the interviews and all that stuff. And knowing that ultimately it's a very simple, could be 3 words, could be 5 words, could be 6 words, doesn't matter. The sentiment is very simple, but it's also very deeply true to the organization. That always is underneath any cultural or regional variances. That's it. Yeah.
All right, so I was just trying to kind of connect the two presentations this morning in terms of the importance of authenticity and creating brands that are more experience-based and more lifestyle-oriented and trying to find deeper meaning. But I'm also, those ideas resonate with me, but I don't know how they translate necessarily to my customer. And I'm trying to think about this more from the outside in, from the customer's point of view, your target market, making sure that what you're doing aligns with what customers care about. And I'm wondering, a lot of what you talked about is, if I understood you correctly, is driven from the organization, from the leadership of the organization, the people that work in the organization. To what extent do you do research to find out what your customers care about in terms of shaping your convictions?
Absolutely. Thank you. It's a great question. Because ultimately, as I mentioned earlier on, what we're trying to get to is messaging. Like, that's really the transition point between what we believe and how we connect what we believe with what we believe you believe, So we're trying to get to that point, because we want to, once we understand, okay, I know what we're about, I know what we believe in, this is all internal stuff, it's all nice and good, but it has to transform as it starts to connect to other people. And so absolutely, we do research, psychographics, interviews, we find psychographics, needs, aspirations, wants, desires, those are the real human things. We find that those actually, those drive purchase decisions, and they drive decision making much more than some of demographics or some of the other ones. So what we're doing is we're working on developing 2 different, essentially, profiles. You have the company profile, which has conviction, purpose, aspiration, and then you have similarly the doing a similar effect with customers or whomever it is we're trying to connect all that we're about, what it is that we are tangibly offering them, and then what it is that they are needing in their life. And so a lot of research goes into that to understand the connection points into those places. Because we're a business, we need to make profit, we're having a product, we got to sell it. There's there's a need to really connect in a very tangible way what's going on, what we're doing and what we're offering. But when it comes to making sure that this isn't just all language to make us feel really good, there is actual tangible research that goes into figuring out what's on the other side of this for the people we're connecting with. Because not only does that obviously influence how we make product, how we position product, and talk about it. But if we really are moving to a more of a lifestyle approach, if the brand is trying to create a lifestyle that they're then trying to project across all these platforms, integrating UGC, it's like we have a flow we're going in, and we're kind of picking up different things that fit with our flow. It's incredibly crucial to know what your flow is so that you can insert all the different consumer content that's coming into it, because ultimately we're trying to connect with needs and then service up products in a way that might kind of like fit into the needs that they might have in their life. So it's definitely it's a bit of a dance, but there's tangible market research happening on both sides to make sure that there's really clear connection points around the moment in time of our consumers and the kinds of things that they tend to align themselves with, the attitudes they have, because you better believe the aspirations and the things that we all carry, we want to find people out there in the world that carry those same things, because that's an alignment that transcends or cuts beneath everything that we're doing. And when you get to that level, then there's a level of connection that kind of supersedes all the noise that's out there.
I actually had a question.
You're not allowed to do that. You have
Sorry,
the orange
excuse
shirt
me.
on. You don't get to do that.
Kind of building off of that and what you were just saying, I was curious about sustainability. So having that conversation internally sounds exciting in the beginning, but if you get negative pushback, or maybe if it's not connecting with your customers, can you kind of talk about, or maybe even give talking points on how to talk with your team about knowing the journey that you're going to have to go on as you're finding your conviction, and understanding maybe if you get initial pushback that you're kind of still filtering through to get to that truth?
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I mean, as we walk through, I say we because it's always me and my wife, so that's my we. The third point for the principles for how you have to step into the journey of understanding your conviction is painfully honest. So that not only is applicable to the way in which you hold yourself accountable to the words you're kind of putting out there, like I believe this, I believe that, but it's also in being very honest in your communications with people. I mean, we always we find it fruitful to almost do like a worst case scenario exercise, where it's like, if we were to like step out with this, I mean, we're not saying we're going to take your conviction and stick it on your homepage, but if this is the inspiration for everything, we got to think through what might the repercussions of that be, and are we ready for that? Because some companies aren't ready for it. They might know their conviction, but like, you know what? There's work we have to do internally to get people ready to sort of shift, going from being like a sales or a product-focused company to then being something that's a little deeper, a little more meaningful. People might not be able to readily make those connections, and therefore, if they can't make those connections, it's hard for them to contextualize what might happen as a response to, like, the Dix thing happening, where there's negative blowback, and that could just force them into, okay, guns, buy them, please. So part of what we do is we do a little like scenario planning to kind of figure out like what are possible repercussions, where might this make the most impact, the least impact, who might be a really, really loud voice against us, who might be a really, really loud voice for us, and how do we come alongside them in the thing that we're all moving towards, so they can help kind of be an advocate alongside us, not because we need someone to be an influencer for our company or for our mission, but we are like aligned in a deep place, and we're going after something together. And so would you kind of lock arms with us as we move forward? It kind of helps to feel like you're not in it alone, which oftentimes, if that might happen. All right. Well, thank you all.
Awesome.